Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about proportions. So a proportion is basically just a math statement that says that two given ratios are equivalent to each other. So remember, ratios are equivalent if the fraction forms of those ratios are equal to each other. So if I had a ratio like 1 to 2, this ratio would be equivalent to the ratio 40 to 80. And this statement as a whole is a proportion. So usually when we're working with proportions, we're not just going to write a proportion like this. Usually what will happen is one of these numbers will be missing and we'll be trying to solve the proportion. So before we talk about how to solve a proportion, let's first talk about how to write a proportion. So for example, let's say that we have a crepe recipe that calls for 2 cups of flour, 4 eggs, 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of water, and 4 tablespoons of butter. If the recipe serves 8 people, how many eggs do you need to serve 24 people? So in this case, we're given a lot of different pieces of information. We know that the recipe has 2 cups of flour, 4 eggs, 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of water, and 4 tablespoons of butter. And we also know that the recipe serves 8 people. And the question is how many eggs do we need to serve 24 people? So the easiest way to write a proportion is to first write out the information that you know in a table. So in this case, the only information that's relevant is the eggs information because that's the question they're asking. They're asking how many eggs do we need to serve 24 people. You could also solve a different problem if it said how many cups of flour do you need to serve 24 people or how many cups of milk do you need to serve 24 people. But in this case, we're only trying to figure out how many eggs we need to serve 24 people. So I'm going to make a table. And the columns and rows of my table are going to correspond to the amounts of what I'm looking at. So I'm going to look at the number of eggs that are needed to serve a certain number of people. And what the ratio told me, so I'm going to make my column represent kind of the original amount or the ratio that they told me. It tells me that I need 4 eggs to serve 8 people. And then the question I'm looking to answer is how many eggs, so question mark for the number of eggs, do I need to serve 24 people? And so if I wanted to set this up as a proportion, I would set it up as 4 over 8 equals x over 24 because I'm trying to figure out how many eggs I need to serve 24 people. And this is the ratio for eggs to people. But you could have also written the ratio of people to eggs. So that would be 8 over 4. And that equals 24 over x. So either one of these proportions will give you the same answer. It's just important that you make sure that the top numbers in the proportion correspond to each other as well as the bottom ones. So in this case, we had people on top and eggs on the bottom, but you could also have eggs on top and people on the bottom. Either one of those is fine. But what wouldn't work is to write it as 4 over 8 equals 24 over x. That would not be an accurate proportion that represents this situation. So now that we've written a proportion, now we need to be able to solve a proportion. So this is the same proportion that's on the last slide. And when we go to solve it, we can either do it by finding an equivalent fraction or we can use cross multiplication. So if we were trying to find an equivalent fraction, we would basically say, okay, well, what do I need to multiply 8 by to get to the number 24? Well, I need to multiply by 3 because 8 times 3 equals 24. And if I multiply the top of the fraction by 3 as well, that tells me that x is going to equal 12. And so that's the way that I would find out what the missing number is with equivalent ratios. And so in the context of the last problem, that's basically telling me that I need 12 eggs to be able to feed 24 people. Then the cross multiplication method basically says that we're going to multiply 24 times 4, and that this is going to be equal to 8 times x. And the reason that cross multiplication works is because basically what we're doing here is we're multiplying both sides of the equation by the denominators of the fraction. So if I multiply both sides by 8, this 8 and this 8 will cancel out because 8 divided by 8 is 1. And then if I multiply both sides by 24, this and this will cancel out. And the simplified version is just going to be 24 times 4 and 8 times x. So cross multiplication is basically just a shortcut for using algebra to get rid of the denominators of the fractions. And then when I multiply these together, well, 24 times 4 is really close to 25 times 4. So if I made 4 copies of 25, that would be 100. But each of the 25s has one additional number than the number I'm multiplying. So I'll go ahead and subtract 4 from 100. And that tells me that 96 equals 8x. Then I can divide both sides by 8. And that tells me that x is going to equal 12. And so in either case, we still get the same answer, that x equals 12. So you can choose whichever method you like to solve proportions. And depending on the proportion, different methods will be easier than others. Like in this case, I think the equivalent ratios method was the easiest. But if we had been trying to figure out how many eggs we need for 30 people instead of 24 people, our proportion would have been 4 over 8 equals what over 30? Or x over 30. And in that case, 30 is not a multiple of 8, so it may not be easy to figure out what we need to multiply 8 by, because it would be a fraction or a decimal. And so in a case like this, it might be easier to do cross multiplication and say, okay, well, 30 times 4 gives me 120. 8 times x gives me 8x. And then just figure out what 120 divided by 8 is. And that may be easier in this situation. So that's everything you need to know about proportions. If you have any questions, let me know.